happy Friday, everybody, and welcome to our Pau Hana. And John, for your benefit, our organization is a nonprofit really dedicated to enabling affordable, sustainable, clean energy for Hawaii Island. And we attempt to do that by convening, by essentially finding the barriers and paving the way to through those barriers. So we're a relatively nascent organization, but we're finding that there's so many groups and individuals that share our passion and our mission, and that makes it a bigger canoe, right? That we're paddling together. So hopefully, with that, we'll have more success. Anyway, for everybody who's joined, I just wanted to introduce John, founder and president of Amana Pacific. John was introduced to us by Harvey Stone, and Harvey, unfortunately, is not able to join us today. He's got a conflicting meeting that he couldn't get out of. So I have the honor here of introducing you, John. I won't go into a lot of the details about you and your organization. I figure that would be best, for you to do that. But before we hand it over to you, we'll just go around the room real quick and introduce ourselves. Noel Marin, I'm a board member for SEH and involved in a number of organizations focused on sustainability and resilience. Peter?
Hi, John. Peter Sternlight. I'm also a board member with SEH.
Thanks, Peter. Ron? Richard?
I'm Richard. I know everybody here. So mainly, I guess what I would say is I'm kind of a rubber slipper guy, yeah?
With very big rubber slippers. Stan?
Stan Osterman, the baby board member at Sustainable Energy Hawaii. I just joined recently. I worked for the state in DBED doing HCAT, Hawaii Center for Advanced Transportation Technologies. I did a show on Think Tech called Stan's Energy Man for 7 years, and now I'm just doing some energy consulting and working with some folks in the Big Island to get hydrogen technology going.
Thanks, Stan. Ron?
Yeah, Ron Riley, Volcano Village, and I'm co-lead with Noel of the Hawaii Island chapter of Citizens Climate Lobby, a national organization working for carbon fee and dividend legislation.
Thanks, Ron. And Benson, thanks for joining. We're just going around the room doing quick intros.
Oh, great.
Okay.
Great. Quick intro is great.
John?
John Cross, independent land consultant, managing lands along the Hamakua Coast and Ka'u districts. And I've been working with hydroelectric establishments.
Thanks, John. Jerry?
Jerry Chang, former state representative and director of university relations at UH Hilo, member of the board of SEH.
Thanks, Jerry. Greg? You're on mute, Greg.
I'm an architect and planner, and I have also have a carbon credit company, and I'm involved in sustainable technology and community design, and I'm working on a water bottling plant in Hawaii.
Thanks, Greg. And Benson?
Hi, everybody. I'm Benson Medina. I'm with Sustainability Partners here on the Big Island, and we're working on trying to build electric infrastructure and automobiles throughout the state. And so I'm glad to be here today.
And I should also disclose that I'm working with Benson.
Yeah. So my partner Noel right here is working on trying to get more electric cars on the road, which is right up his alley, right? As you might know.
Yeah. Thanks, Benson.
Yeah.
Okay, John, with that, I'll turn it over to you. You have the floor, and I'm sure there'll be a lot of questions as we go through this. So we can keep it casual. It's all yours.
Sounds good. Aloha kako. Appreciate meeting all you guys, and in typical fashion, I'll start with my presentation, I'll go a little bit deeper into who I am and my background. That way, it'd be really good for us, hopefully building a long-term relationship, working together. I think there's a lot of parallel synergies here. And I think once you see our approach, some of what you used to express, Noel, as far as finding the challenges and then finding solutions to those challenges is kind of the exact same approach we've taken. So excited. And then, of course, with the benefit of it being recorded, we'll go a little bit deeper in the detail, but also stop throughout the presentation and make sure I can field any questions in the meantime. And please don't hesitate to interrupt me if there's something you want to talk about. Sometimes I talk too fast, or sometimes I get really passionate in this stuff, so I want to make sure I don't do that. But we'll start here with our deck. Is everybody able to see that?
Yep. Yes.
All right. And then so a little bit about me. So as you said, I'm the president of Mono Pacific and co-founder, which is a benefit corporation out of Hawaii, Maui, Hawaii here. I also sit as a board trustee for the American Renewable Energy Institute out of Aspen, Colorado, which is a nonprofit. I do a little bit with the Leadership Council and the National Small Business Association, helping, making sure we have leverage points for Washington, D.C. for some work we're doing. I'm an island ambassador with Island Innovations, which is basically a group that brings across islands from across the world. Similar to what we're challenging and kind of bringing the similarities of the Pacific Islands together. Island Innovations brings the islands from around the world together. And I think they had over 20,000 people participate in the last event. And again, it's all about sharing resources. We're all in similar canoes, so it's best for us to share stuff. I'm a senior advisor at MK Advisors, also a board member at the local Paiute Youth and Culture Center here in Maui. And then I sit in the environmental caucus for the Democratic Party of Hawaii, helping with legislation. Sounds like Ron does some work in. Then I was a Hawaii national delegate in 2016 and 2020 to the DNC for Bernie Sanders and was a floor whip for him at the convention. And then more technically experienced, I'm a nuclear submariner. So I basically run the nuclear propulsion plant, electric plant for nuclear submarines. And besides being a mariner, is also a U.S. Navy diver. And then, my biggest passion and kuleana is being a water protector. I was involved in Dakota Access Pipelines work, went to Flint, Michigan after the poisoning there, was involved with Stop Line 3 in Minnesota and gave my medals back to the governor of Minnesota and protested and worked with different speeches with the Native Americans, Ojibwe and Anishinaabe out of Minnesota and Washington, D.C. And now I'm part of a Shutdown Red Hill. We're basically part of a citizen suit and nonprofit helping address the Red Hill crisis and bringing solutions to the table, but unfortunately having to use the federal court system to get the stakeholders engaged. So my background goes back after being in nuclear energy. I was in renewable energy here in Hawaii, doing projects for the Air Force, Walmart, University of Hawaii, but eventually wanted to really help people that need it. And American Samoa is a community that over 80% of the population is below the federal poverty line. And it's one thing to be below the federal poverty line for such a large population, but their energy rates were as high as 42 cents in 2012. So imagine, trying to sell loaves of bread when you have a $10,000 a month electric bill just to run your ovens, So we went down there, and through that work, I started working with and built a relationship with the late High Chief Utu Malai, who's the executive director of the American Samoa Power Authority. First helped them solve some water crisis and issues there and energy issues with, basically pro bono. And through that, gained his trust. And then we basically started off with our first project here was a 1 megawatt solar farm. And we used their structure of basically providing all of the savings and then allowing the utility to basically maintain all of their operating expenses. So we were trying to make sure we made a model that wouldn't push the utility out of the market, basically allowed them to maintain their jobs and make sure that they were able to maintain the grid. But then all the other savings would pass on to the ratepayers. And so through a grant from the U.S. Department of Interior and through a bidding process, we won that project and were able to save the ratepayers about $500,000 a year. After that, Governor Lolo at the time and Utu put me on the governor's airplane and flew me out to the Manua Islands. These are the sacred Manua Islands where God Tagaloa bestowed man and woman, and very important islands for them. But they were basically losing about $500,000 a year in energy rates just subsidizing the Manua Islands. And so, out there we basically helped develop Ofu and Olasenga first, and we got that project and was funded by the U.S. EPA, the U.S. Department of Interior, and then ASPA put some money in there. We got them to 80% renewable energy, and we actually powered that on Earth Day. And then we developed the project for Ta'u, and we brought in Tesla and Solar City, who ended up constructing that project and got Ta'u to be powered by 100% renewable energy and can be powered 3 days without any sun based on their battery energy storage. And that basically, again, saved them over $500,000 in having to subsidize the rates on the Manua Islands where they don't really have a lot of income. And on top of that, they were basically having to throw sometimes barrels of oil into the ocean to get people to swim out to them during high tides or high sea levels. And that basically, again, allows us to protect the ocean reefs from possible spillage or leakage from these barrels on the coral reefs there. And then the last major project that was really powerful for us was basically bringing private financing into American Samoa. American Samoa being unorganized, unincorporated territory made banking there very difficult. Almost so difficult I wanted to give up multiple times, but it really taught us the difficulties of bringing financing to the Pacific Islands, which is one of the biggest challenges outside of Hawaii and New Zealand, to move projects forward. And we were eventually able to come up with some very novel basically approaches as well as contracts that we're able to work that we're going to try to replicate across the Pacific Islands. And by doing that, we're able to put a 20 megawatt solar farm and battery energy storage project, which the actually battery storage project is being expanded now. But we're able to deliver energy at 12 cents a kilowatt hour, as opposed to the typical rate that they were facing from fossil fuels could range anywhere from 15 cents to 35 cents a kilowatt hour. And again, all of those savings are meant to be passed on to the ratepayers. But through my time with UTU, he also created an organization called the Pacific Power Association. About 19 years ago, he organized with 11 of his colleagues all 25 utilities across the Pacific. And through uniting them, basically helped, again, share resources, share knowledge and information. And that way they could help each other through a lot of these different challenges. And he taught me a lot about that, as well as the cultural issues and difference between Micronesia, Melanesia, and Polynesia. Some of the geopolitical issues, as well as the logistics and banking problems in the Pacific. And so learning all those problems, I really didn't really understand what he was really bestowing and passing on to me until he passed away, unfortunately, 4 days after agreeing to be the godfather of our son. But it was then I kind of realized, like, wow, we have a lot of challenges we need to face. But if we can find solutions to these challenges, we can truly lift up a third of the planet, which is all the Pacific Islands, which have been, in my opinion, I think a lot of economists agree, held down by the fossil fuel industry. It's the high prices and the volatility of the fossil fuel industry that has basically held down our economies across the globe. And basically, no matter what efforts we make in commercial fishing or tourism, which are sometimes, unfortunately, our only sources of revenue, the fossil fuel rates can basically, wipe that out from underneath pull the rug from underneath our feet. And so with that, I'll go into a video. But before I show that video, I wanted to see if there's any questions so far before I jump to the next spot.
I do have a question, and it relates to your observations and experiences, dealing with the island nations, and it centers around the apparent or emergent impacts of the climate crisis, right? So as you've gone through this journey, have you seen changes in terms of sea level, in terms of erosion? Things along those lines. I mean, it's very obvious with some of them, like Kiribati, for example, right? I mean, they're literally needing to relocate. But have you seen evidence of that in your work as you've gone through these different island nations?
I mean, the short answer is yes, yes, and yes. I mean, we've seen it firsthand, and what's even more powerful is just hearing the stories of the different villagers and tribal members that come to these events, to carry their stories, and it's really difficult. It's everything from villages now having seawater taking over at certain times their entire villages and watering their homes. Them having fear of, like, how are they going to, because we have to understand, especially in Samoa and some of these other cultures, in Micronesia, Melanesia, is that, their tidal power comes from their land. And so, like, that their whole lineage of their ancestors is based on that land. And so losing the land for them isn't just about losing their economy and losing a place to live, which I think is already important and be devastating for us. But it's their entire lineage and their identity oftentimes is being wiped out and disappeared. And so that's what's really difficult. And even in Palau, some of the stories of, they have the stories of their sea turtles, and there's very mythological and spiritual understandings of the Honu and their Amakua. But then hearing that these turtles would basically come to certain places and bury their eggs, but now because the water is rising, they're now burying their eggs in certain areas where they're covered up, so that the eggs are no longer hatching because they're now underwater because there's not enough sand at high enough sea level. So I mean, it's truly deafening and decimating. And one of the issues, though, is as they continue to harp on the importance of climate change, I think it was the president of Tuvalu who did a very powerful statement at COP26 this year in Glasgow. They did a recording with him standing at a podium in the water as basically a really good showing of, like, the realities of what we're facing. And I think what's still difficult though is for the rest of the world, they live in a different sphere, they live in a different perspective, and so that message still isn't resonating. So we're trying to continue to push that message, but also I think unfortunately the world revolves around economics, and so our biggest push is explaining the economic importance of addressing climate change and energy, transition to clean energy. How in the Pacific Islands it makes sense in every single island economically to do it. And that's what can get the West to understand. But as Pacific Islanders, I think we just know underlyingly it's climate change and it's our identity.
Thank you, John.
All right, I'll go here and play this video, and then we'll go right into the Mono Pacific.
We are on the front line of the climate crisis. Pacific Islands are facing disproportional pressure from the changing environment, and everyone is paying the price. We need to act today to prevent future loss and negative impact. Meet Mono Pacific, an established B Corp operating under a 6B principle: pledge, process, platform, prosperity, people, and plan. Our mission is to empower the Pacific by building economically and climate resilient solutions to our current global problems. We do that through projects in the fields of renewable energy. We work very closely with our constituency. We listen first, then offer solutions. Collectively, we have already brought many projects to life. At this moment, we're building a project on the island of Molokai, which is set to impact the lives of thousands of people. We achieve our impact through both grassroots and institutional cooperation. We engage both top-down and bottom-up approaches to encompass all stakeholders, from local communities to a partnership with the U.S. government. We're now working towards scaling our solution through the Moana Pledge. We need your support to grow and expand our positive impact beyond the realms of the Hawaiian Islands, to impact the entire Pacific regions and then go beyond. We have the potential to impact the lives of over 100 million people by bringing climate resilient solutions to solve issues of energy and justice in the Pacific region. Become part of the solution. Stand with Mana, stand with the people, stand with our planet.
Then we need people like Mana Pacific who can actually put together the finance and the technology to make those things happen.
So having an organization like Mana Pacific to coordinate the various participants, the people who want to be at the table, is incredibly valuable.
Mana team, thank you very much, because you're helping show a different way of approaching renewable energy development. And I think that's what's really important right now with where we are in our stage of the renewable transition. We really appreciate what you guys are doing.
Right, yeah. So Mono Pacific, was kind of born out of that legacy with, working with Utu'e Malai and, how do we solve these problems? And so in short, we deliver resilient, renewable energy solutions to Pacific Island nations. And we use our certified Moana Pledge approach to aggregate the demand, and which lowers the costs and the investors' risks. And by doing that, we basically are able to accelerate project development, which is the key. And some of the, and we make sure that we do this in coordination with, the needs of the communities. We basically are align ourselves with the government infrastructure goals as well as our climate change goals. And then some of the other efforts we're basically finding that really align with ourselves is basically the ability to counter the Chinese Belt and Road Initiative. This kind of happening in the Pacific, we can talk about later in greater detail, and other predatory lending initiatives that we think kind of present a national security risk, whether it be to the United States or just to the Pacific Islands in general, because the last thing that we need is a conflict in the Pacific, after what we're seeing in Ukraine. And so, as I said before, Mono Pacific is a benefit corporation, so we are a for-profit entity. Unfortunately, a nonprofit is not in a position to be able to leverage and to do some of this development activities. But at the same time, we wanted to change the model and kind of adopt what Patagonia uses, the benefit corporation, where our board of directors basically has to balance not just the shareholder profits, but balance that with the people. And that's the people that are a company, as well as the people that we serve in all the communities and the planet. So making sure that we're balancing all three of those to properly earn our income. The problems we solve in the Pacific, are, as we said before, are very much similar to Hawaii here. Energy insecurity in the islands is definitely a big one of them. Oil supplies, and it's not just the cost of the oil, it's the supply frequency of the oil. Sometimes just getting oil to the islands is very difficult. If there's a shortage, the Pacific Islands are unfortunately at the very end of that list. Pacific Islands are oftentimes very small and remote or disassociated. So for investors, again, it's just large cultural barriers, small projects, not a lot of money. And so for them, they're looking at Australia, United States, Europe. I mean, these are large markets with large investment money, and they're looking at just like, that's where they want to make their money at. To them, it just seems too difficult or too much of a pain for them to deal with the Pacific Islands. And so one of the questions is, why hasn't it been solved yet? 90% of the islands, basically on fossil fuels. Again, this goes back to this just remote, it's just economies of scale. And I think where it really is, it's just a lot of these developers just don't have the experience. And as we've seen them sometimes, unfortunately, have difficulties in Hawaii. For those that have traveled around the Pacific Islands, which are sometimes more conservative or more culturally sensitive, if you have a problem in Hawaii, kind of resonating with the local community, especially the Native Hawaiian community, it becomes even more difficult in the Pacific Islands. And I think people just are looking for easy money, and it's a much bigger market. And so one of the things that we're looking at doing is basically consolidating the market together. And so with the 21 Pacific Island countries and territories, all together, that's a $57 billion market in equivalency if we were just to, address everything with solar and storage. And obviously we're going to use wind and geothermal and other technologies, but just the easy comparison, it's a $50 billion market. Now that market, what's really interesting is, as we talked about earlier before we started this meeting, was EVs, right? So as electric vehicles transition to the Pacific Islands, which I think originally they were, saying like 10 years, I think it's significantly more, shorter than that, because one of the biggest things about electric vehicles is that, as these electric vehicles make the market in China and the United States, they have, let's say, 400 miles of range. Well, once they get down to 100 miles of range, they're running into a situation, or 100 to 200 miles, that car has almost zero value. Well, I think very quickly those cars are going to find their market in the Pacific Islands, because an electric vehicle with a 100 mile or 200 mile range has almost full value in the Pacific Islands, because that's all the range that we need. But once that happens, what does that mean? That means to charge those electric vehicles, we're going to need, almost 60% of the energies in transportation in the Pacific Islands. So that market will double beyond $50 billion to $130 billion. The other thing that we need to look at is that less than 50% of the Pacific Islands actually have access to electricity. So again, as we move rural electrification efforts, providing energy to a lot of villages and communities that want access to technology and energy, especially for education purposes and for ability to earn income, again, that whole energy market, including transportation, is going to double again. But so by bringing those together, now instead of a small island asking for assistance or asking for financing, we're talking about, even a $10 billion tranche in the first, or $5 billion tranche in the beginning market of solar needs and financing needs. Now investors are very interested in working with the Pacific Islands. And then we've talked to manufacturers and said, hey, if multiple islands are going together, are you willing to provide most favored nation pricing? And they're like, absolutely, we'll guarantee you the best pricing that we've given everyone in the next 2 years. And then we also have another advantage, is just the ability to basically consolidate islands together that are very high risk, with like Guam or Hawaii or New Zealand that are basically low risk. And by blending those together in a portfolio, we're able to basically provide a blended tranche for the investors, which makes it far more palatable. And so, and the concept of want to pledge from an architecture standpoint is that basically we kind of go back to our ancestral roots in a way, where it's about bringing the islands together and through unity, right? Strength, it comes through unity. And we kind of practice this in Hawaii, for example. But one of the things that I think we wanted to really practice here was just basically, making a truly a handshake deal for two reasons. One is, I think, back in the day, our ancestors, it was, our word was our bond, right? And so this handshake was all that was necessary. And then that was what we would judge each other on going forward, is that if we make these agreements and commitments, even with a handshake agreement, your reputation is what will carry you forward. The other reason, and to continue working together, the other reason this is important to make it a non-binding compact in this initial form is to gain all the interest so that everybody can join in. We don't have huge hurdles for people to have to go into binding agreements, which can become very difficult, especially with politics. allow everybody to see that actually everyone is on the same page. We all have these same common goals. We just need to work together onto the next step. I think people being able to see that all the other stakeholders are there ready to go is very important. And the last reason, from a legislative standpoint, is by making a non-binding compact, it allows us to enter into an agreement that's not considered a treaty. Because once it's a treaty, it oftentimes requires either 51% or 2/3 of a Congress or a House of Representatives or FONO in order to approve such a treaty. And that, again, becomes a very significant, either a barrier for entry and getting them to come on expeditiously, or B, becomes a very weak or a very spot of weakness for us, where basically that's where the fossil fuel industry or other lobbyists are able to get in there and basically try to shoot down those issues. But the idea is that, in short, after this binding compact, then this next level is a master power purchase agreement that we've crafted and we've basically piloted American Samoa that allows us to bring financing to the island, minus the last stages, which is securing land, securing the technology, and securing the project, or the utility infrastructure needs. And those are the last pieces, but otherwise it's a binding a contract. And those contracts can be done based on the sovereign territory. So, even technically, we thought Hawaii might be markets that might be too tied up in red tape to enter, but we are talking now and going to a conference here on Big Island and seeing whether or not the county of Hawaii could, for example, join the Moana Pledge with these Pacific Islands and join in these benefits and maybe become an example for the Pacific Islands to join. And then after this master agreement, which would be, for example, the county of Hawaii, individual projects would be signed into full power purchase agreements as we see today, done underneath that binding power purchase agreement. And so one of the other things we did before we really launched the Moana Pledge was get a third-party certification. So for those of you that know the Solar Impulse Foundation, they basically were the first fossil fuel airplane that flew on the world, kind of showed everybody, we have to take moonshot steps and we can do them if we just truly do it. And then after they flew around the world without any fossil fuels, solely on solar and battery power, they created a foundation which now has a whole panel of experts, I think it's over 100 and some experts, that basically come through and certify solutions that basically are efficient, scalable, and bankable. And so we were one of the first solutions that actually was a process. Everything else is a technology. And so we were our first process. So we actually had to go through their process 2 times selection because they had never done something like this. But eventually in September, we were certified as a solution like that to kind of give a third-party validation of that this would work from an economic standpoint as well from a technological standpoint. And then after that, we were at the Our Oceans conference in Palau with John Kerry from the Biden administration, and we were there for the climate conference, the Our Oceans conference, and then we were able to sign Palau basically committed, as we got Hawaii to commit to 100% renewable energy with the Blue Planet Foundation and many other organizations here in Hawaii we've all worked with. We basically, Guam has since carried suit and committed to 100% renewable energy. American Samoa is committed to 100% by 2040, 12 other states. And then now we got Palau to commit to 100% renewable energy by 2032. And then President Whips has agreed to be, he believes in this as well. They've signed on to the Moana Pledge, and he's going to be kind of one of the lead champions for the Moana Pledge, bringing the Pacific Islands together, starting with Micronesia. And then we'll be bringing all Melanesia and Polynesia together. And then we're working with SPREP, an organization in the Pacific Islands, to basically then use this as a campaign to go to COP in Egypt. And one of the biggest things that we're trying to do, and this again would be another reason why I think Hawaii would be great to join, is there's $100 billion everyone keeps promising to help these, these communities that really need and want to address climate change, and we're not seeing this money for multiple years. And so now we want to go there and say we have the people, we have a process, we have a platform, and we have a pledge. Where's the $100 billion? And hopefully in Egypt, we can finally shake loose the breadfruit tree and start getting some money coming to the Pacific Islands and actually accelerating these renewable energy projects. And so last thing here I'll go into before I'll take another break here is Molokai. Molokai has formed their own energy cooperative called the Ho'a'u Energy Cooperative. And they basically entered the market by competing in HECO's community-based renewable energy program. And so we partnered with them. And so they've made the news very significantly. We've partnered with them as well as Shake Energy, kind of giving them the tools and resources to be able to, technically and financially be able to compete and earn revenue and own and operate their own project at Molokai. With their aspirations are to eventually, buy out HECO, or at least own all of the generating capacity on Molokai and be in charge of the planning of it, and then leave HECO just the transmission and distribution of Molokai. And so they've been very successful in doing that, as well as raising federal funds from Senator Schatz, who's also helped them as well. And so that's been an exciting project because it's really about empowering the community there. And this one, of course, is also led by a lot of Native Hawaiians. And it's a really important process too, because through the PUC process, we've been able to expose a lot of the issues that HECO has used, basically suppressing independent power producers and communities from these type of owner-operator structures and community cooperatives. And so we've exposed a lot of those. Some of those, the fight still continues, and unless we get denied, we can't really take those fights any further. But we did get, or the cooperative was able to get HECO to basically not bid with their self-bid team in the bidding process, which I think for me and for the community in the islands all believe that is a huge victory, that their self-bid team isn't bidding against the Molokai community. And so I can't talk any further on how far that process is along in the bidding process, because that is covered under disclosure, but they've been successfully put in a bid that's been, we think is very, very exciting. And things we can talk about is that they were able to get financing from both an outside investor, an outside bank, a tax equity investor, and they also have been able to source funds from the on-bill financing program GEMS in Hawaii has been able to help them as well. So again, building new models that I believe can be completely replicated across the Hawaiian Islands. And so I'll really go quickly across our team. Michelle is our co-founder. She's done a lot of work in Africa as well as in Haiti. Sam she's Native American Ojibwe and did a lot of work with the PUC in Michigan, worked as well in the governor of Michigan, and then started working in Africa as well as Haiti before working down the Pacific Islands. Oya's done a lot of work in helping the Bronx and some other communities there in financing. Bryce is a business analyst from Maui. He's done a lot of work basically with our research. And then Sierra is an intern out of Berkeley that we hired on, and she's been really good as far as learning policy. Now she's actually moving to New York and be working with Ambassador Reed from Palau and working at the United Nations. And we got her an office there right next to the United Nations complex to kind of help our efforts there. And then I'll just go into here. We just brought on now Ambassador Frankie Reed, who's a lawyer out of Berkeley. She worked for the State Department for several years, was the Deputy Assistant Secretary for East Asian Pacific Bureau, was a former ambassador for Fiji, Kiribati, Nauru, Tonga, and Tuvalu. And then Ambassador Lincoln Bloomfield here was also a national security official for the Reagan and both Bush administrations, was also a U.S. ambassador. And serendipitously, Lincoln Bloomfield is also the grandson of the Honorable Joseph Gordon Coates, who's the first Kiwi-born Prime Minister of New Zealand. And he also works on CNBC. And then Catherine Hammock also brings in some Army expertise, being the former Assistant Secretary of the Army for Installations and Energy. And also works a lot of nonprofits from ASHRAE and Slipstream, you guys might have heard of, and helping build the green economy as well. And again, so a lot of these diplomatic ties, the reason we have them, and Joe Reed, West Point graduate Army officer, is because, not only is this about climate change in the Pacific, there's a very geopolitical environment we have to be aware of. For those that don't know, as we're doing this Wanna Pledge, China is literally now kind of doing a similar compact, trying to unite 10 islands and give them money and infrastructure around the Chinese compact. And the reason we're afraid of this is traditionally in the Pacific Islands, where they're a lot more impoverished than we are in Hawaii and don't have access to the central banking system, is they use predatory loans. They basically say, hey, how much money do you need? And they'll give them even more money than they need with semi-reasonable, but interest rates that are reasonable, but really it's the amount of the payment that's oftentimes hard to afford. So once that fuel prices gets really high, they can't pay that back, but these are sovereign-backed guarantees. So once you become in default with a sovereign guarantee, that's when China takes over ports. And basically our fear is that they take over a port, then they bring a Chinese military vessel into that port to dock or refuel. Then we believe the U.S. Navy is going to basically bring down what's called the show of force, bring down a carrier group or a battle group, show of force, and then China's going to do the same. And once that happens, then it becomes a major threat to the U.S., especially with the fact that Pearl Harbor has traditionally been very strong in the Pacific Islands and kind of kept it as a neutral territory. That type of escalation and leading to fever pitch could very quickly lead us into what we're seeing in Ukraine. And we think some work we're doing with State Department, or discussions with them, we should say, we're not in formal negotiations yet, that by using U.S. government backing financing, we can get rid of sovereign guarantees, provide financing to the Pacific Islands, and even infrastructure loans and guarantees from the Build Back Better Act and other infrastructure programs coming from the U.S. federal government in Hawaii help provide financing initiatives that don't need Chinese sovereign-backed guarantees. And by doing that, we think we can create an economic buffer in the Pacific Islands from either military basically expanding and causing friction in the Pacific. But again, so those are partners there. Lastly, Blue Planet Alliance, we're working with Hank's effort. We're the first members there. Again, helping Pacific Islands commit to 100% renewable energy mandate like we did in Hawaii. And then our goal is using the Moana Pledge as the roadmap of how then to execute the roadmap to 100% renewable energy. And so again, we'll stop there. I think it's a lot we've covered, and answer any questions you have there before I go any further with this presentation.
Yeah, well.
Go ahead, Richard, and then Stan.
Yeah, that was really impressive. Looking at the world picture like you just last described, like for Hawaii, we got to do the same thing. We got to know what's happening in the world. Then we got to focus back here under our feet and figure out what kind of resources we have and maximize the use of it. Very impressive. I like that.
Oh, that's exactly it. It's about, right, we have to look at the high level, and that's why I believe, and we'll discuss it later in this presentation, what you guys can do in Hawaii Island and what we're doing in Palau, I think are the models to be replicated across the Pacific. And then that's exactly it. We got to build the models, scale it, and then we become the model for the rest of the world. Exactly it.
Yep. Exactly.
My question was about nuclear energy, being that you're a Navy nuke, sub-nuke guy. With fusion being a potential for small-scale nuclear, what is your take on that in terms of helping these small island nations be more energy independent? Do you think that's a viable option, or is it still off the table?
It's completely viable. The question is where it's political and public opinion of it, and it's also the commercial marketability of it. Like NuScale just came out, which is a very safe reactor. It's completely new technology that I think we can win over hearts and minds with it. But the technology is having difficulties financially. They can't deliver energy rates where they need to be at, where they were promising at. Other SMR, may be able to do that, but we have, Ramit Dome and Marshall Islands. We have to get over the fact that there's a lot of fear around nuclear power because of, it's not nuclear power, in my opinion, that's been bad. It's been the handling of it. Even Fukushima, they had a chance to solve Fukushima during the disaster. But again, sometimes our pride and our other mismanagement gets in the way, and that's what's causing disaster. So we have to solve those issues. So our approach is, a little bit technology agnostic, but to kind of more answer your question more directly is, I believe, the hydrogen economy is the future that we need to build, right? And now, is that nuclear power, fusion, or geothermal? I think it's all three of those, but we need to basically figure out every island is going to pick a different energy source, right? Or certain islands, if you don't have geothermal, your only other option at this point in time to really go into hydrogen production and exporting it is going to be either nuclear, or fusion, or it's going to be large scale wind, OTEC, wave, or some sort of like that. So I think it's on the table. We are discussing ways we're going to kind of push it forward, and Pacific Islands can kind of be the caretakers of it and show that nuclear power can be safe. But it's definitely still it's a unique navigation we still have to go through.
Yeah, I'll add it because we have a lull here between my dog barking. But I didn't really talk about my background. I spent 35 years in the Hawaii Air National Guard, and from 2009 to 2011, I worked at US PACOM J5, and I tried really hard at that time to get PACOM to look at helping the energy initiatives throughout Oceania, and there was no interest for it, and it frustrated the daylights out of me because I understood, this is before Belt and Road was online with China, that we had to take a foothold in these island nations and make them self-sufficient, or China would be in there. And even if China was benevolent, that would be a bad thing, but China's not benevolent. And like you say, they use Belt and Road to basically be a predatory lender, and they go into these nations and then take over sovereignty of their ports and things like that. So my hat's off to you for what you're doing. It's really important. I've actually been to Kiribati. My wife is from French Polynesia. I've been on Wake Island, Midway, Johnson Island, New Zealand, Samoa, Saipan. it's there's a real need out there for people to be doing what you're doing. So my hat's off to you.
And my hat's off to you, Stan. You understand this, and you come from a very rich background. And to you and to everyone on this table, I mean, this is a problem that's not just for us to solve. I think it's for all of us to solve. So the invitation's open for you guys that want to help out informally, or even forming a formal relationship. We have project development funds, and you help make these things successful. We want to share those proceeds with the people to help do it. So we want to make sure we, properly, pay for and compensate the people helping make this reality. But more so, you guys, I can tell your passion and heart's where it's at. And sometimes we need to be that bridge between the military mindset, and we also understand the cultural sensitivities of the islands. Sometimes we may be the only ambassadors to be able to bridge that, and so we need as many ambassadors as we can. So the invitation's open.
Thank you. Yeah, I in listening to the story about the predatory lending and what China's doing, I mean, it's a very, very sophisticated model that was originally developed by the United States coming out of World War II. You're familiar with John Perkins, yeah? Yeah. So it's a very appealing but very, very, very dangerous rabbit hole to fall down in, and I'm really, really impressed that is something that you're looking at, and that is that you found a way to really offer an alternative to it, because when you're resource starved, what seems like a good idea today turns out to be a complete trap down the line. And so thank you. It was very nice.
Well, yeah, and that's exactly it. I think, it's about Pavlov's, right, a hierarchy of needs, right? And we don't have security, we don't have, money coming in. We basically grab on to anything we can. I think that's what the Pacific Islands are like. It's like our poor neighborhoods, right? Why do payday loans do so well there, right? When you are forced into survival mode, you have to take these things. And so I think, we just want to get the U.S. military and U.S. government to understand, by just providing this financing to help lift them out of poverty, that's the type of trust building I think the Pacific Islanders will understand, and that's what's going to build the inroads that the U.S. government wants in the Pacific, is that genuine, authentic trust in relationships. And so I thank you guys for seeing that. Any other questions? I can take you guys in the last round of this long presentation.
Very impressive. Do you use any carbon credits in any of your financing or any of your work to offset?
As of right now, we aren't using carbon credits. We do have a partner that built one of the largest carbon credit markets in the globe. The carbon credit market has since semi-collapsed. So, it is coming back up. So it's a big talking point. We have to be careful because some carbon credit markets use greenwashing. But one of the things we are talking about doing, which may be very viable here on Big Island too, is Bitcoin mining, but not just Bitcoin, is also just cryptocurrencies. And there is a model using a version of solar coin we are in discussion with, that if we basically allowed the generation of renewable energy onto the grid, that carbon credit was then certified as a crypto coin as opposed to an REC or a carbon credit. But the same model that they use to create this crypto coin, we've also discussed with them that 1 megawatt hour that goes on the grid, us just certifying that you put a megawatt hour onto the grid anywhere in the Pacific Islands, that could create an REC, it could create a carbon credit, and it could create a token. And we think by doing that, we may be able to anticipate, or basically create, investors that want to build data centers in other parts of the world to create a cryptocurrency, to just build solar farms, wind farms, and geothermal plants, because that by just creating that energy, they're creating their own cryptocurrency. And so we're looking at variations of that. But again, it's a very wild market and a lot of different opinions there. And again, some people don't want to take that risk. So we're just kind of crossing that slowly.
Yeah, John, I'm originally from New Zealand, and I follow the news down there as closely as I can. And the talk about mining Bitcoins, there's a company just started up fairly recently in New Zealand, GridShare, and their software is sharing the electric power from a hydro from a small river. And when that power is not needed, they're diverting it to Bitcoin mining. And I don't understand how that goes, but you know what you're saying is actually happening. The company name is GridShare, and I think the river is called Monowai, Monowai. Question that I have is on Facebook, I'm seeing quite a few posts and ads for a company called Oscilla Power, Oscilla, Oscilla Power, and they're doing a trial project actually in Hawaii right now for wave energy. And I wonder if there's any comments that you might have on that.
Yeah, that's the first I heard of their name, but I think, wave energy for us so far has a huge potential, right? I think the Pacific Islands, it could be very important because not just the wave energy itself for generation, it's not just the ocean rising that becomes a threat to our islands, it's the wave action that comes with that rising ocean and basically hitting more erosion in areas that aren't used to that erosion. And so wave technology could basically stop that wave energy from hitting our shores and producing energy. I mean, that's a godsend in my opinion. The biggest problem is what they're doing right now is proving the bankability of that, right? So once wave technology hits a bankable power purchase agreement level, then I think we're very comfortable expanding it and scaling it across the Pacific. But there's a lot of technologies that the ocean is saltwater and extremely high energy. And unfortunately, man-made technology does not fare well with either one of those two so far.
Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, it was our experience with the Marine Corps based Hawaii wave action. They had a lot of maintenance involved in keeping those things up and running. If there's a gentleman named John Petrie who has some fairly unique, the thing can be used for energy generation, electrical generation, or desalinization, using a fairly unique platform. And so if you look up John Petrie and his platform, it might interest you. I had a question for you though. In regards to the increasing fossil fuel prices, timing is everything. Is this going to hamper what you're doing or be a big shot in the arm and boost to what you're trying to do with so many nations that are dependent on fossil fuels?
Yeah, I mean, it's a big shot in the arm as well as what China's doing in the Pacific, as them encroaching, obviously just, again, proves our model out because we've been talking about this Chinese BNR and how we could counter it before the Solomon Islands. And then we use the Solomon Islands as an example, and that was before we even knew there was a security compact there. And then talking about that, then again, this 10 Island Initiative, which is completely separate, came out. And so it's just reiterating what we've been saying and kind of proving us correct. But I'll be honest, sometimes just being correct isn't enough for politicians. You know what I mean? I filed suit against the U.S. Navy 3 weeks before the spill in Oahu, and they thought we were crazy. And then now it's like the spill happens, and they're like, oh my gosh. And then again, they feel they can do it on their own. And so we're just up against people that are, like we're still new to them, or they're just not used to what type of company does diplomacy. So I think for a lot of them, it's just them wrapping their heads around it and just getting their attention. So we're making inroads. But again, people like you, that if you were to join in and the squeaky wheel gets the grease, I like to say, right? And the more that we talk about them and tell enough people, I think finally decision maker will get what we're doing and hit the gas pedal on it, So we just keep chipping away at them. But if not, what I'll do is I'll try to go through this next couple slides quickly, and then we can go ahead and keep answering questions, because I think this other part of it, some of it may be preaching to the choir, but I think it's just it'd be a good foundation for our next conversation, if that makes sense. All right, and so again, kind of what we talked about with Richard Ha commented is, it's teaching by demonstration. And so this is where I really like working with you guys, and why I think in Hawaii and Palau it's very important. It's seen as believing. Renewable energy, even solar. When you talk about it in the theoretical space, people are just like, wow, that sounds good, or it's too good to be true. We have to actually do it before people listen. And until people start residentially doing solar and then talking about $17 electric bills, people didn't believe it. Once that happened, people were like, wait a second, this is real. This really works. And so that's why I think it's so important, the work you guys are doing on Big Island, and maybe the work we do together, is becoming that example. And I really think, one of the things that's really unique about the Wanna Pledge and what we're doing here is that while we solve our issues and our economic issues and climate change issues in the Pacific Islands, some argue, we're only a percentage of the off gas or a percentage of the carbon emissions, but it's about showing people how it can be done. And I think ancestrally, the Pacific Islands, especially our Native Hawaiians and our indigenous communities, ancestrally always lived in harmony with their environment. So teaching them to live in the Aopua system and live in harmony with their environment, that's in their bones, that's in their EV, that's what their ancestors taught them. All we have to do is bring the money and bring the technology to the Pacific Islands, and I think they will teach us how to implement it in society. And I think once that's done, and we take these third world nations economically, they're traditionally been depressed for decades, and bring them into the future by just empowering them with money and resources, they will show us communities of how we all want to live. And I think once we show a community that everybody wants to live in, right, that's when tourism really has a value, because people can come and see that and live in it and say, like, oh my gosh, this is the way I want to live, and bring that back to the communities. And we can turn consumerism, upside down, where consumerism now gets us distracted with social media and consuming products. But once they see living in harmony with their environment can be economically prosperous and good for society, I hope and believe people will consume that, and that's actually how we can address the climate crisis in time. And so one of the other concepts here, and I'll go into later why I think it's so important, is when we make this transition to renewable energy, I don't think that's the only thing we need to do. I think it's very important we also understand the importance of community ownership, right? It's not just transitioning to renewable energy, it's community ownership. And so, and very simple, I understand I'm being overly simplistic here, but just to illustrate that, an economy on an island, we're very isolated geographically and economically, right? And so right now we have tourism, the federal government and military puts money in the economy, commercial fishing and agricultural export, right? As we export stuff, we're getting money. But all of that money, this bucket here represents our economy. And so as we, pay our electric bills, well, most of that energy goes to fossil fuels, and that's leaking out of our economy to people that don't spend their money in Hawaii, don't pay taxes, and don't reinvest it. So that's lost money, right? Every time we fill our car up, we're paying for gas that was shipped into the island by an owner that doesn't have ownership in Hawaii. And where are they spending the money? Not in Hawaii. And then, of course, 70% of our foodstuffs, 90% of our staples, 99% of our staple foods, we're importing, right? So what is that again? Money that's just leaking out of our economy. And so one of the most important things I think to remember is that if we go ahead and fill those holes by basically not relying on fossil fuels from outside, and we have community ownership, the bucket starts to fill, because now, right, we can have tourism and the federal money and all this money keeps coming in here, but no longer are we paying electric bills to oil companies. No longer, hopefully, are we filling our cars with oil money. And so the importance is that by having local ownership in the islands, we can lift up the entire island's economy, and that means wealth for everybody. I think that's the real goal we need to take on here. And so one of the models here, this is kind of a bridge of the Morse model. I think would be great is like Richard Haas community cooperative, or a different community cooperative model, right? Using the county in partnership by using green bonds or other municipal bonds, is a way that we can have local ownership. Because if we go ahead and just say, let's go geothermal, and then we find a geothermal investment company from New York hedge fund or from Europe, right? That is still better than we are doing now. So I'm all for that, right? But if we are bold enough and can go ahead and create our own cooperative ownership that owns that generation, now that funds comes into the cooperative model and allows them to distribute the funds back to the community. And that's really, going back to community, it's not just, that allows them to be like, put money back in education, put money back into the environment, as well as, energy savings. Because I think one of the important things is we always want to use energy savings is give it back to the consumer. But I think, let's face it, I think we should need to give half the savings back to the consumer, let everybody prosper in energy savings. But the other half of it, I think we need to kind of reappropriate where our focus needs to be. And to me, that's education to the environment. But really, it needs to be, a new board of members of the local community made up of cultural and spiritual leaders, environmentalists, and education members and leaders of the community to kind of decide where that money goes. And that way, the government can decide where the money goes in the government, and the cooperative can decide money where it goes in the cooperative model. And so here's a conversation again. I don't need to pitch this to you guys. You understand it. Where do we go beyond 100%? And that's really 500% or 1,000%, and that's hydrogen. But some of the things I think is important to remember here is, it's not just about replacing the needs of large battery farms, but, for the Pacific Islands, we like it because it's like, here at Hank's Ranch, right? It's cooking fuel. Using a lot of wood or coconut husks is very prevalent, and propane. And so for Pacific Islanders to be able to produce hydrogen, offsetting the need to ship in petroleum is a very significant need. And then for Palau and Hawaii Island, which you guys share in common, is one I didn't put in here is we're talking with Maersk. So commercial shipping is a very unique opportunity that you guys have that is a big player in investing in hydrogen. So building hydrogen shipping or having them be partners in it, I think is very strategic. And then United Airlines and Alaska Airlines have both hedged into the, carbon or fossil fuel free airline market. So again, both of them committed to hydrogen. So if you guys producing hydrogen, I think that's a very significant resource, for us to go into the Pacific. And the reason that building this hydrogen economy in the Pacific Islands is so important, it's that not only by reducing renewable energy, just going to clean energy 100%, are we increasing the overall economic and individual wealth. Is once you increase the hydrogen export economy into this whole picture right here, it's that the Pacific Islands, who traditionally have to make money off of commercial fishing and tourism, which are both, no matter how you balance it, even with green tourism or ecotourism, whatever you want to call it, they're still extractive processes, right? They're still, hurt our resources. And so if we can produce enough income from the hydrogen economy, President Whip said, hey, he'll shut down the entire commercial fishing around his entire island, his entire nation. And I think by doing that, Pacific Islands, across the globe would be able to basically really take seriously conservation of fishing in our ocean, which I think we all understand our ocean is tied to our entire ecosystem as much as our climate is, and something we need to protect. And so I believe right now there's nothing on the table other than hydrogen or cryptocurrency that can do that. And so one of the things that we are looking at doing and talking about in the Pacific is basically, introducing, data centers into the Hawaii Island with geothermal. I think will allow us to address the geothermal issue, the base energy. Where do we get this low cost energy from first? And then as soon as hydrogen hits kind of that next level of efficiency gains, we're already in a position to then just expand the geothermal. We already have planned phase 2 and phase 3 ready to go. We're just waiting for hydrogen to get there, but now we're ready to do it. We just can pull the trigger as soon as it's ready. And so, I think there's a valid roadmap for us to execute geothermal in Hawaii and then plan hydrogen as the next phase once it's ready to go. And the last place I'll go here, just as an example, I like to use this illustrative model that I talked about before COVID-19 was, the rail project on Hawaii. We were able to find $10 billion of funds for the rail project. I don't know how. It's been ridiculous. I won't get into the politics of that. But that cost us to raise our taxes. And if we did this with renewable energy and invested $10 billion into renewable energy infrastructure, these are cash flow positive projects. So unlike the rail project, which is going to cost us every single year and raise our taxes, and now we're talking about raising our taxes even more, investment into renewable energy infrastructure of $10 billion wouldn't raise our taxes at all. It would generate $250 million of annual savings to the state of Hawaii, assuming we spread these projects across the state of Hawaii. And then after paying back the debt service, assuming we use green bonds, it would generate over $168 million of annual revenue. So as opposed to the rail that's going to cost us, it'd be generating $250 million in savings on people's electric bills and $168 million of annual budget surplus that the board of directors would then have to decide, where do we give that money? Energy savings, to our schools, to our agriculture and our farms, to our oceans, environmental programs. Again, a good problem to have for us to do that. So again, I think something we really need to consider, not just pushing geothermal, not just getting to hydrogen, is how do we, move that ownership model into our communities because once that model gets moved exclusively into the big industry, it's gonna be really hard, to shift that into communities. Now is the time to strike. And lastly, again, I'm probably speaking to the choir here, but the Hoover Dam was the last major project that we basically, from a public perspective, invested money into. And that dam, other than the issues with climate change and water scarcity, has been producing energy at a rate of 2 cents per kilowatt hour. So if we really tackle geothermal in the right way, we're basically doing nothing more than recreating the modern day Hoover Dam model, which has been proven successful. So it can be done, it has been done, and I think it should be done again. And again, why I'm honored and happy to talk with you guys, because I think you guys share the same energy and passion. And again, that's the end of this last part of it. Now it's my time to listen and get your thoughts and see how we can work together. Mahalo.
Yeah, I'll be my typical rambunctious self and start talking again. Something that came up while you were talking was, when I first met my wife and traveled to French Polynesia, there was a big problem with Copra Plantations. Basically, the trees were hitting max life, but it costs money to cut the trees down and replant, and that was a problem for the local economies. They couldn't cut the coconut trees down and replant because they didn't have the money to do that process, and the copra industry, with competition from South America and stuff, was just not competitive. So is that still an issue with island nations? I mean, that was a big agricultural export for most of the island nations back 30 years ago. Is that still a problem?
Well, I don't think that's a problem with the Pacific Island nations. I think it's a problem with the business model, and we've corrected that. So, for example, in renewable energy, the same thing happens with grants in the Pacific Islands. They can give grants for a solar system, and that solar system gets built, but there's no O&M budget in there. So then all of a sudden, the Pacific Islanders don't know how to fix it. An inverter goes down,
right?
Software update, and now 3 years later, that solar system is providing no energy because they haven't done a software update, or they haven't fixed a panel or a fuse because no O&M budget. So the same way that they should have fixed the copra industry is the same way we're fixing the renewable energy industry, is building in an O&M model into the business, right? So just like a bank, they don't buy a solar farm without having all of the operations and maintenance already budgeted into the operation of the project, as well as a reserve fund to cover replacement of failed projects. So if the copra industry financed every 5 years, we have to cut down the trees and put that back in there and put that as a cost in their business model, I don't believe, just understanding the basics of it, they would have had that problem. But we're doing that with the renewable energy industry. Same with the geothermal. If we have hydrogen and geothermal, we have to have a full sustaining model, just like we're a hedge fund owning a geothermal plant in Hawaii. We just do it because we don't want just the banking returns. It's also our community's energy and our sovereignty and our resiliency. So that's why we're going to invest in the long-term, business model.
Yeah, and I mean, I'm all for, especially, I love your bucket presentation, because I've been saying for years that if Hawaii would just get off the fossil fuel tea and they could appreciate the renewable energy return on investment in our local economy, it would be mind-boggling. We spend so much money. We basically import so much, and tourism is an export. Military is an export. Agriculture used to be an export, but we've lost. We lost tourism during the, our pandemic, and also before when we had 9/11. The Japanese tourists, Chinese tourists quit coming because out of respect for the country, in mourning. So we're really susceptible to those kind of things. What intrigued me, though, was for Oceania, a lot of these places like Kiribati, they have huge areas of ocean, and they have no way to enforce their own fishing. They own these EEZs, and they should be able to profit, but they can't even protect it from overfishing, from poaching, from pursing. They just can't. China and whoever, Japan and Korea, even come in and fish. But if they had some economic stimulus from what you're doing, they could actually go out and enforce. One of the few victories I felt like we had at PACOM back when I was there was we actually negotiated with the Navy and some of these countries that their game wardens could ride on Navy ships that were transiting the area, and the Navy ships were allowed to actually help them enforce, because those countries don't have ships. They don't have patrol boats. They have little tiny skiffs that they'd run around on, and they can't go 100 or 1,000 miles out or 500 miles out. So those kind of things that you're allowing to happen to make those countries sustainable is also good for sustainable fishing worldwide, so that they can stop the overfishing and some of the predatory fishing, not just the predatory Chinese model.
At the base of that is that, kind of the model, economically, it's like there's a whole litany of issues just like that they're facing. And I think a lot of these sustainability and conservation efforts require money, right? And they cost money, right? And we, as a society, we haven't valued that cost of that money yet. So they're being underfunded, right? Even like our education, we haven't valued our education yet. That's why we underfund it. But, when I was part of a Pentagon task force to basically kind of look at a disaster in Hawaii, how would we face it? Energy was the biggest component, and it was the first component we had to address, because we had to address energy first, because security needed energy, communications needed energy, food needed, frozen reefers needed energy. So by solving energy first, we could then solve all the other things we needed to restore order on Hawaii. And so the Pacific Islands, economically, we're doing the same thing. We believe is renewable energy is the one thing in every single island we can guarantee give them immediate savings. It's cash flow positive from day one. Now, what they do with that savings, we recommend investing into all those efforts that you're talking about, right? Investing into, protecting the EEZs, ocean conservation, environment. That's up to them to decide. We will give them, pointers of what we think should reinvest in. But most importantly, we've given them that ability to reinvest that funds and figure out what they want to do with it and empower them with that. Yeah.
Well, thanks for making all that part of your charter, because it's really important. And thanks for promoting hydrogen too. Personally, I really like that.
Absolutely. And just so you know, before I go over to Benson here, anybody that wants us to help to raise funds, we are looking for fundraisers before we get into equity investors, and we're offering, again, financing for that. So we are always asking for people to help us look for right investors, because we don't just want any investors, right? We want investors that understand this mission, because if we have the wrong investor, this whole model disappears, right? So we just want to be very careful. So we love your help with that. But go ahead, Benson. Sorry for that.
Yeah, hey, no worries. Yeah, I just wanted to know if you knew anything about this undersea cable that I've been hearing people talk about, that going from the Big Island to Pearl Harbor to take geothermal energy there. Do you know anything about that, or is that just?
They planned. HECO's planned it before. Whether it be a wind farm, looking at large scale wind, and then Molokai. They basically said they're going to put a giant wind farm without asking Molokai to put a wind farm there. And the idea is that on our islands, here's a big problem with renewable energy, is that the biggest consumers of renewable energy from a state perspective is Oahu, right? That's 80% of our energy usage and population is in Oahu, right? Whether it's tourism or local populace. The same thing on each island, the majority of our energy usage is in our hotel industry, where the hotels are at or where the apartments are at, right? You can't sit large-scale solar farms there. So in order to address it, from an island-wide, is we need community solar, but that's a regulatory issue we're fighting with HECO and the PUC on, is we don't have what's called virtual net metering. Because if you can put a solar farm where it's cheapest in a very cheap spot on Big Island where there's nothing, nobody cares about the land, nothing can grow there, it's non-sacred land, you can put a really cheap solar farm there, put it on the grid, and the electrons can go all around the grid wherever you need to and power the hotels and everybody else. That's the cheapest, most economic way to do it. But HECO doesn't want it because they lose money on wheeling. That's why wheeling is currently illegal. But it really was a big deal in the mainland. Now, from an island perspective, from a state perspective, the idea is if you can produce energy really cheap on Big Island or Molokai, you get the electrons to Oahu. So what was their approach? The easiest path was an underwater sea cable. But now that hydrogen can be used not just to bring hydrogen from Big Island to Oahu, but let's say Palau wants it, or if the ships are basically go to hydrogen, and Maersk is like, fine, we're going to convert some of the first commercial, hydrogen ships in the Pacific to hydrogen, but not every Pacific island can generate hydrogen. How are you going to get the hydrogen there? Well, then you need to bring the hydrogen to those islands, for the airline industry and the shipping industry, and you have to do it by shipping. So, underground sea cables have traditionally been the way that we've done it. We might as well spend that money into ocean shipping because it solves 3 birds with 1 stone as opposed to 1 bird with 1 stone.
So Benson, I'll add to that because I agree with John 110%. I was working with Governor Lingo and PACOM on the undersea cable back in her administration. It was really expensive. It was really complicated, and landing the cable was a real issue because the military wanted to land it on a military base so they could control the power. So there's a lot more issues with the cable than most people realize. And I agree with John that hydrogen makes a much, much better sense, especially from the perspective, like he mentioned, that we could then export it and it becomes another income revenue source for Hawaii.
Another reason too is about diversification, right? It's like when you're selling energy, if we have an underwater sea cable, we have one customer, and that customer has a problem. Just like we're seeing in Europe and Ukraine and Putin, you have to deal with that customer. Otherwise, you're one or the other. But if you have hydrogen, which can go on a ship anywhere, you're not beholden to one customer. If they're not going to pay you and someone's going to pay you more, that ship's going to sail to the new customer who's going to pay you the right amount of money. Or if you have values, you disalign, right? Then you can still ship to somebody else. You're not stuck with somebody.
Hi. My understanding about the current iteration of the discussion about the cable, undersea cable from the Big Island, based on as yet to be developed geothermal, is that it is a project specifically for the military. So that one customer would be the military, and I'm not sure. I haven't really heard of any mechanism by which it would affect the general population in terms of having an effect on rates or anything else. It would be specifically a national security issue. It also is a single point of failure.
Yeah, so maybe good to clarify, when they talk about underwater sea cables, there's two separate initiatives. One was a previous one with the Kiko, and I think next year was a part of it with the wind farms, which was the ratepayer one, and the new one is more of a U.S. military DoD resiliency issue. But again, I think the DoD, until they find a better mechanism or tool, right, or gadget to do it by, they're going to be stuck with that. But if you were able to present a model where hydrogen could be used to replace that underwater sea cable, but also go to every single military base by trucks and give them resiliency with hydrogen, they might be very well an investor in your guys' venture, because you would change the model and provide resiliency to potentially all the bases in Hawaii, which then can be a model that they could then provide resiliency across all of their bases across the Pacific Islands. Because just one little piece of anecdotal evidence here, my friend's parents worked for a company called Public Warehouse Company. We basically supplied, all the bases in Iraq and Afghanistan, and they were paying upwards of $100 a gallon for fuel at military forward operating bases, because the trucks moving fuel across those lines were extremely expensive to give them resiliency. They were getting shot up and blown up. But the U.S. military, if they start producing their own hydrogen at the military base themselves with their own solar plants, they don't have to be bringing in fuel across all these dangerous lines. So I think the U.S. military really needs to move into hydrogen, but they need someone to kind of walk them into it. I think the potential of you bringing them hydrogen as opposed to underwater sea cable makes that more of a reality for them. So I think that, again, it's a value proposition I think they would be open to, but again, it's really hard to get the military to shift forces sometimes too, but worth the effort.
I would almost go to say it's almost impossible. I mean, after I got out of the military in 2014, I spent 6 years trying to convince the Air Force that hydrogen was the way they should go forward. And they kept saying, oh, but hydrogen fuel cells make water, and water freezes, and we have to go in Arctic conditions, so forget it. And I said, well, tell me how your batteries work at 40 below zero. And they just kind of went, but it was almost impossible. I was working directly in support of the Air Force, and the project I initiated on Hickam Air Force Base, Joint Base Pearl Harbor Hickam, was the Flight Line of the Future, which had solar panels. We have the only Leeds Platinum hangar in the Air Force at Hickam, and we have solar panels and enough solar generation to basically make that wing, that fighter wing, self-sustaining. So we designed it, and we had Flight Line hydrogen vehicles. We had a weapons loader. We had a large aircraft tug, could tow a 747. We had vans and emergency power supplies. And I still couldn't convince the Air Force that hydrogen was the future. And I finally wrote a paper talking about if you actually had to deploy a fighter squadron overseas, and you had battery-powered support equipment versus hydrogen support equipment, how every one of your airplane C-17 flights would have to be shortened by 2,000 miles, or you'd have to take equipment off because the weight of the stuff you're shipping is so heavy that you can't get it all there without unloading some of it, or just accepting the fact you're going to have another tanker refuel the C-17 to get it where it needs to go. That got a little bit of traction in the Pentagon, but the biggest successes we got was with the Army and the Navy, not with the Air Force.
Well, we are working with the Army and the Navy, so let's talk later, Stan. I want to learn more about those projects and any material you can find on those, because, as they're talking about expanding in Palau military bases, I think replicating what was done there at the Air Force would be great for the Navy and the Army to replicate in Guam and the Army, and the Navy and Palau and the Army, and then that's right. Second time's a charm, maybe.
Hope so, or maybe just from hitting them so many times for the last 6 or 8 years, maybe it'll finally sink in.
It's like
but,
teaching our kids, right? They never listen the first time, but if you give them enough lessons, they'll eventually learn the lesson.
Yeah, maybe if I was a Navy admiral instead of an Air Force general, they'd listen to me. But yeah, they didn't want to listen to me. But you're right on the money. I mean, everything you're saying is just spot on as far as I can. I'm convinced.
Wow,
And so, congratulations on your work.
Yeah, very, very much agree with what you're doing. And the entire model is really quite impressive. And while we've been talking about a lot of the components of what you're talking about, but seeing what Mono-Pacific has put together and that it's operating, working, and functioning, as versus it, it's the aspirational model I certainly have had in my mind. So. Love to talk about this further in the future.
Absolutely, love to. You can read the rest of the team too. I'm just one of the members. There's a whole bunch of them, so that's the best part. Go ahead.
Yeah, I'm going to mute Richard. I think he was having a side conversation. Yeah, no, I just wanted to acknowledge that we're over time. Really appreciate, John, you spending your time with us, and more importantly, the work that you're doing. And it's very evident from what you've shared today that there is a tremendous opportunity to collaborate, work together, learn from each other, and maybe even make more connections. So really appreciate that. Greg, I noticed you unmuted. Did you have anything to ask before we wrap up?
No, I thought it's a very strong model, and I'm glad to see him conglomerating nations. I do a lot of carbon credit work, and it's not greenwash. There's a lot of value to be created and a lot of stuff that can be combined. When you do a carbon credit, you have a project area. It could be entirely Micronesia. It could be enormous areas. So then you make one application with all these different sites. So there's ways to get efficiency out of the carbon credit process as well for a common solution that could be spread across all the islands.
So, I think agree. Yep, it's not the vehicle that's bad; it's the way it's been used. But if we do it right, it can be a valuable tool. So yeah, let's talk more. Definitely excited.
Yeah, I do hope that you do connect, because Greg had presented in a previous Pau Hana, and he shared very compelling information about the model that he's utilizing and the proofs behind it. So yeah, I do hope that you connect.
One model I've seen recently that just kind of blew my mind, and I'm being hired to be the consultant on it for the carbon, is this group put together a cactus, a Nepal cactus carbon project. Now, I'd never even heard of it. And, Nepal cactus is prickly pear. And on all the islands, you have a wet side and you have a desert side almost, right? You have a hot side. And this group had discovered that cactus sucks down as much carbon as the rainforest, and trains it through the roots into the soil. So it actually does a better job of permanently sequestering carbon into the soil than a rainforest does. And then this one group has actually hybridized the cactus, so no spines, and grow super fast. They plant 35,000 cactus per hectare and make between 2,500 and 8,000 tons of CO2 sequestration that sells for about $11. So between $25,000 and $80,000 a hectare, which is 2.5 acres, just from the carbon credit. Now, the real product is the cactus that ferments 10 times faster than manure and can be made into a fuel. And the big thing that seems to be missing on the islands is transportation fuel, which you can make directly. So I just kind of learned about it, and I'm looking closely into it, and I'm astonished at how far along some people are on some of these. It's essentially a afforestation carbon credit that uses cactus instead of trees. So I begin to think, this might work for islands that are half desert and half tropics, right? And it's a very fast growing crop now. They harvest it in 9 months.
Yeah, they need more agricultural products, so that would be really good. Mangroves on the wet side and then cacti on the dry side. Yeah, on the corner side.
You can also make artisanal liquor, and you can make all kinds of interesting food products as well. And I think that could be blended into the. Everybody wants to try something from the island,
Yep.
I just had some spam flavored macadamia nuts.
Well, those are the best sellers, guys.
I know, I'm shocked. What?
That's the best seller at Hamakua Macadamia Nut.
Okay. Well, this was great. Really appreciate the time. The recording, I'm pretty sure will have a lot of mileage. There's a lot of great information that you've shared, and I do hope that this translates into even more contacts and opportunities to collaborate. So, John, once again, thank you.
Thank you guys very much. And again, thanks for recording this.
Yeah, thanks, John.
Aloha, guys.
Aloha. Good weekend.
Thank you.
Aloha.